Welcome to today's presentation, Continuous Compliance in a DevSecOps World, Why Compliance as Code Matters. Let's go ahead and get started. Adam, take it away.
Excellent, thank you. I also want to thank everybody for joining today, taking time out of your day to join us. It's excellent, thank you very much. So I'll go ahead and get started. I think we'll go past this slide. And what I'll be talking a little bit about today is basically taking compliance toward, agility. Like how do we get to that? And really, I think it's about foundational automation. Before I get into that, what I'd like to do is talk just a little bit about CIS, who is the Center for Internet Security. We are a nonprofit organization that basically leads global communities to define and publish security best practices. We've been around for about 2 decades now. We're more than 200 employees across the United States. We do have our headquarters in East Greenbush, New York, an office in Washington, D.C., but we do have a presence via remote workforce in several states across the U.S. I mentioned that we make security best practices, so I'll talk a little bit about these. So one of the ways we try to create confidence in our connected world is by leading communities to define and publish these security best practices, which you likely know as CIS controls and CIS benchmarks. The CIS controls are a prioritized set of critical security controls that your security program should consider. And naturally, the CIS benchmarks are part of that foundation, and what they do is establish or help you establish at least and maintain secure configurations within your boundary of responsibility. I will also mention something else that's, I think, germane to this discussion here is that CIS does operate via funding from DHS, the multi-state and elections information security Information Sharing and Analysis Centers. So the MS-ISAC and the Elections ISAC are both operated by CIS. What these organizations do is essentially monitor state, local, territorial, and tribal information systems in the U.S. And what this does is, you may have heard the phrase, offense informs defense. Well, in the case of security best practices at CIS, offense, basically as detected by our ISACs, truly does inform defense. So what they see out there in the real world on a day-to-day basis comes back to us and to our communities as we develop our security best practices. So, being largely community-driven, having a membership, having, a reach into some operational environments, gives us some view of, the trends that we're starting to see in this industry. And one such trend that we're noticing is a fairly strong desire to move away from what I would call an antiquated notion of running a security program. Essentially, when you look at a traditional compliance paradigm, you'll have an enterprise that establishes an information security policy, and that policy is expected to satisfy requirements potentially from several different control frameworks all at once. Now, most of these frameworks from which enterprise information security policies are derived are based on this loop, right? So you might recognize this as the observe, orient, decide, act loop. In ISO 27000, it's known as plan, do, check, act. Essentially, no matter what framework you're looking at, they'll have something similar to this. And in fact, the similarities between control frameworks, it's probably enough of a discussion for a completely separate webinar. Suffice it to say at this point that most control frameworks are really equivalent in spirit. And in fact, what you see here is plan and organize moving into deliver system security, moving into monitor and evaluate, into improve and adapt, and so on. That's actually essentially a summation of an investigation into 14 different control frameworks from around the world. They really do all say the same thing. Now, when the idea of being compliant to a more abstract policy, the control framework in this case, first began, I think we were on multi-year cycles. So, in some venues, they were looking at 3+ years to execute this OODA loop. So every 3 years or so, we'd observe the enterprise, orient ourselves based upon updated information, make some decisions, and then take some actions, and then do it all over again on that cycle. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I think the cycle has improved, so we may not be on this massive 3+ year cycle anymore, and we've definitely realized some gains in continuous monitoring between the monitor and evaluate and improve and adapt boxes there. But nevertheless, I think we still have these long audit cycles that are essentially predicated on a waterfall mindset, where you have different organizations doing their work and then handing off to another organization to do their work and so on. And the further along you get, if something goes wrong, you have to start all over again. And now lately in the service delivery space, essentially, especially in service delivery, we've seen a surge in this DevOps concept, right? And for information security, I think we're starting to call this DevSecOps. But in this DevOps model, the teams providing a product or service are essentially the experts in providing that product or service. Now, a product or service could be internal or external. So, right, your IT shop, for example, offers services to the rest of the company. So that would be like an internal service, and they may well develop applications inside your organization, which would be like an internal product. But these DevOps teams typically follow this cycle where it's plan, create, verify, package, release, configure, and monitor, and then it continues. Now, this kind of figure eight loop is usually built into a continuous integration and continuous delivery process. So, there are no months or years long cycles in that. It's continuously ongoing. Now in the space of product and service delivery, they tend to have an advantage over traditional audit space, if you will, in this traditional audit paradigm, is that they can represent more information as code. But this sort of starts to get into the differences between the models, which we can talk a little bit about now. So if you look at these two things kind of side by side, take the concepts, the notions behind them. It might not escape you that the OODA loop and the DevOps cycles aren't really that different from each other. So you're doing some planning, you're doing some implementation, you're maintaining things, and that's all, on a repetitive feedback loop. So you're basically going through the same steps to different levels of granularity, perhaps. But they're not that different from each other. What does differ is how they're executed. So and that yields the time it usually takes to accomplish the cycle. So the OODA loop on the left usually takes quite a while to accomplish, which could have a variety of reasons behind it. And then the figure eight on the right is usually executed continuously. So there is no long duration of time associated with that one. But to me, then the question becomes, so why is one so much faster than the other? And my assertion at this point is basically that in the DevOps model, teams are empowered and accountable. They can deliver their product or service with concise requirements. And they're able to speed their execution by leveraging automation, which is really an important point. So then what can security programs do to realize DevSecOps, like to move in that direction if you haven't already started doing that? So articulating security requirements in a code-friendly way, I think, is really important. An example of this is when your policy says you need to use strong cryptography on information in transit, then your enterprise standard needs to be as specific as possible. So you need to have that associated with your policy. So as an example of that, so you might say, okay, use TLS, but that's not quite enough. Which version of TLS do you want to use? And then beyond that, which cipher suites within TLS are you actually allowing them to use? Because some shouldn't be used at all. And then, of course, associated with all of that are the digital certificate requirements. Like, how are you going to get those? What are the precise details about the life cycle of a certificate, for example? All of those things need to be as specific and granular as possible, which, in my opinion at least, gets toward being more code-friendly. I think the second thing that we need to do is really empower the teams that deliver the services and create the products that you have in your environment. And given that first suggestion of articulating security requirements in a code-friendly way, this should be an easier thing to accomplish. Basically, what you want to do is you want them to own the responsibility of information security. It's more effective in the long run when the team feels this ownership. And beyond that, in order to empower the team, really then you need to have all of the appropriate resources and skills on that team. So if you need a security architect on the team, somebody who can represent all the security requirements that are being derived from your policy, then go ahead and do that. The third thing I have here is to think more iteratively and less waterfall, right? So don't think in terms of waterfall anymore. Try to think in lean terms where you're trying to make small changes. The small changes are easier to develop, they're easier to deploy, definitely easier to troubleshoot. And I think an additional benefit is that because you didn't take a whole bunch of time up front to plan everything out and plan every detail, that when the inevitable change happens, you're actually being efficient inherently. So you're not wasting a whole bunch of time in planning and rework. The final thing I have here is to maximize your continuous integration and continuous delivery, even from within your security program. It's just a winning combination, really, in my opinion. If you have those concise security requirements built into an automated, continuous integration and continuous delivery service, you can essentially get to the point where you'll make a change in policy. That change then gets rolled out almost automatically throughout your entire enterprise where it needs to be applied. So I think in conclusion, what I wanted to talk about here was just kind of my potentially boring parting thoughts. It's just a little bit of a characterization of how CIS has grown over the past decade, or nearly a decade. So if we look at 2 points in time, 2010 and 2019, in 2010, our overall membership was actually less than 300 members. And today we're more than 10,000, and that's international across 19 different market segments. Our vendor members, and these are the security software vendors who come to CIS and become members so that they can build CIS's security best practices right into their products. In 2010, that was about 10 members, or somewhere in there. In 2019, we have more than 50. And then the last number I'll mention is our benchmark downloads, which was more than 1 million last year. And I think we're on track to beat that this year. All of these numbers to me kind of suggest, especially because they're on an upward trend, we haven't seen any downturns in this period of time, is that the importance of security best practices has really increased over the past decade. And frankly, I don't really see that slowing down very much. And with the complexity in systems today, that getting from policy, security policy to implementation is really a critical thing. And one way to do that is just automation. So I think that concludes my part, and I can hand it over to Galen. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, so Adam laid out a couple of things that we need to do as organizations to be successful in the DevSecOps world. And I really want to dive into a little bit of the compliance as code side. So how do we actually make this happen? What does this kind of look like? And how do we go from there? And so first off, let's just kind of reiterate kind of what the problem that we're working with is, right? The first stop is that we are just plugging security holes. Security often is viewed as a dam in the organization where we are focused on preventing things from getting to production that are insecure. And so we work really hard to make that happen. But at the same time, the business still needs to do its job. And so oftentimes holes get poked in the process in order to accomplish the task the business needs to accomplish. And what we end up seeing is this kind of scale between speed and security. And for the most part, that speed wins, right? If you're in a highly regulated industry like financial or federal or healthcare, things like that, then maybe security wins more often than not. But if you're, if you're a West Coast startup, speed is winning day in, day out. And the problem that we're running into here is that the core structure is that we really can't compromise on security and compliance, right? These are non-negotiable components. The CIS benchmarks and controls are the best practices that we should be following within our organizations, but the way in which we're doing it has been very, very difficult and very slow. And the interesting part is that the perception is true along both sides of the problem. In the IT professionals and DevOps communities, we believe that InfoSec policies inhibit agility and speed, and the information security policies agree with that information, right, to a very high degree of the process. And what that runs into is that, like, it's just going to be slow, right? And there's the question of, like, is being slow a problem? And the answer is that for the business, it is, right? The core component is that DevOps and DevSecOps are being adopted by the enterprise, and that you're going to have to go fast in order to be successful, right? The question on everybody's mind at this point in time should be, what happens if Amazon decides to get into my space? What happens if some new startup without the 100 years of business comes in and decides to try to disrupt me? If I'm slow and unwieldy, I'm going to fail, and they're going to succeed. And so we need to integrate security into the process. And not just from a business speed perception, but, like, there's a risk problem too, right? Fundamentally, the majority of the exploits that exist and occur are using already known vulnerabilities. This isn't that we're getting hit with a bunch of 0 days. This isn't that we are being exploited in new and fantastic ways with machine learning and AI. No, it's just core infrastructure, configuration management, and maintenance of our systems. And so, 2/3 of breaches take months or longer to discover. Plenty of teams need weeks, months, or days in order to fix issues that we find. And the reason for this is that, as Adam was talking about, the process itself is painful. The process is not in that kind of DevOps continuous implementation model. It's not in an agile model. It's very large, very, very big components. And so when we're operating in waterfall, we have this very large component structure of we go from dev to QA to staging to security review. And this process could take us weeks or months to get to. And then security is going to kick it all the way back to development. And we'll go back from dev to QA to staging to security review. And we often iterate in this loop 3 or 4 times before we kind of get through the process. And if this process takes us a couple weeks to a couple months, we're talking about months to years in our release cycle before we can go to production. And there's no management of the exceptions. We're catching the problems late in the process, et cetera, et cetera. And so, like, this is very slow in terms of how our business operates and how it wants to operate. And we don't even talk about audits, right, or the other components that happen outside of the development process, the other times in which we have to provide an understanding of our security footprint. Due to the nature of the manual work that we do, we often run into the situation where it shows up as being fairly compliant, but in reality, we're actually dipping quite a bit below compliance because we're making the systems compliant just long enough to pass the audit, and then they're going to drift away from that over time. And so, again, the information that we're having is not the whole story, and that we are running into a very slow process to make changes happen. So how do we actually, like, what's the core component behind this problem? Right? Why is this a conflict? Why are we inhibiting speed? And the answer is language. Everybody involved in the process is talking a different language. Our compliance and audit teams are often talking to us in spreadsheets or PDFs or binders or rules and regulations. The security teams have their own scripts, their own automation, their own little pieces that they work to scan systems and understand them. Sometimes it's manual, sometimes it's automated, things like that. And then in the DevOps world, we're talking about code. We're talking about automation, getting the human out of the process, just checking code into source code management, and then going from there. And so what we need to do is we need to actually bridge that gap. We need to start modifying the way that we talk to each other and codifying that to work well. So in the old way, right, in that kind of observe, orient, do, act loop, we have a lot of people working directly on machines. We very much have people logging into a system, make a change to the system, verify the change, and then log off the system, and the system's up and running. The problem is that it doesn't scale. If I've got thousands or tens of thousands of systems, it doesn't work very well for me. So I have to make sure that I automate that process. And so we do that with code, right? This is the DevOps community. This is the DevSecOps community. These are the ways where we're trying to do it. And one of the things we need to do when we start using code is we need to start sharing information about the structure of what we want to do in these various pieces. And so here's where Chef Inspect comes in. We have some language that we can use to translate the compliance into code and really get a clear understanding between everybody on what's going on here. And so what we want to do is express these benchmarks, these rules we want to follow, these core hardening principles as code in a way that allows us to ensure that everybody is working off the same language. And so what we want to have is the control information, some metadata around it, so we have some context about what's going on with this particular control, this particular benchmark, and then the actual code itself that we're actually working with here. In our language, it's just really simple. The package, libsc Linux, should be installed. Very straightforward, very easy to work with. And so if we do this, if we put this into code, instead of having the previous model where we go from dev to QA to staging to security and then back, we can do this as a continuous process throughout the entire cycle, right? So as Adam was mentioning, we want to implement CI/CD as much as possible. This should be a core component of our CI/CD cycle. We often talk about this as shipping security left in the process. We want to make sure that the developers have the information about the security requirements as early as possible in the pipeline. The earlier they find out about it, the less time it goes between when they write code to when we find out that code is non-compliant or insecure. And the earlier we can go and fix the process without wasting a lot of energy going through multiple stages and multiple environments to get to things working. So just a couple of examples of how this thing actually works as we go through these. We've got a couple customers that we work with. One of my favorite ones is the shell shock security issues. Customers who utilize continuous compliance and desired state configuration management are able to remediate zero-day issues in under an hour that would take multiple days manually. We have another customer who can patch 250,000 systems within 6 hours of a patch being available. Right? These are the kinds of speed components that you can achieve when we get through continuous compliance, when we get through desired state configuration management, and when we get into true DevSecOps. And the last thing I want to mention is that as we go through these things, the core component, the core baseline of this is what we get from the CIS, from the Center for Internet Security, which is the actual benchmarks themselves, the actual best practices, the best of breed recommendations on how we do it. And these are some of the content that we have over with Chef in order to make this thing happen. And with that, I'll wrap this up and hand it back over to, I think, Aaron to lead us out.
All right, great. Thank you, guys. I have Alan here as well, who's going to help us walk through some questions. So feel free to submit any questions that you have for Galen or Adam, and we can get those answered for you right now. So I'm going to pass to Alan, and we can facilitate some Q&A.
All right, cool. Thank you, everyone. My name is Alan Baptiste. I'm a product marketing director here at Chef, and I am pleased and honored to be your question moderator. So if you have any questions, there are a Q&A tab that you can enter your questions. As they come along, we will certainly address them as possible. Okay, guys, here's one that I always wondered. So how can a modern enterprise organization, software is pretty prevalent in the marketplace. Every company is a software company, many say. How can we ensure that these, modern software or software-like enterprises ensure compliance with a variety of control frameworks? Adam, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, sure, Alan, thanks. So one of the things that we do at CIS with the CIS benchmarks, at least, is we map any recommendation we can. It may not be every recommendation, but any recommendation we can, we will map that to one or more specific sub-controls in the CIS controls. And then we also have mappings from CIS controls to a variety of different control frameworks. So if, a contrived example is a hospital that in the United States that needs to process credit cards, right? So, and maybe they're publicly traded. They might have some HIPAA requirements there. They might have some Sarbanes-Oxley requirements. They definitely have some PCI requirements, right? So if they have a security program that is founded on the CIS controls and they're using CIS benchmarks, they can provide evidence in support of HIPAA, SOX, and PCI just by applying the benchmarks that are mapped into the CIS controls that are then mapped into those variety of frameworks. Does that help?
Very cool. So, okay. So we're seeing some other questions come in. Here's one. How, as an IT administrator, how can I help ensure that my computing resources are provisioned securely? And how do they stay that way? Either of you?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take that one. So yeah, in order to ensure that the resources are provisioned securely and stay secure, what we want to do is make sure that we have some control of the process. And typically what this means is putting this into a pipeline. And what I mean is to say, the way that we make changes to any part of the infrastructure, whether it's the provisioning side or within a VM or a container or whatever it is, the only way for those changes to happen is to be governed through the pipeline. And inside the pipeline, we do a couple things. One, we can run our continuous compliance checks to verify that the thing we're building, so if we're building a VM, that the thing we build is secure. And two, we're at the end of the pipeline, we're going to go ahead, even though we're in production, we're going to go rerun those checks, and we're going to run them continuously, right? When we think about audits, when we think about security, this isn't a single-time event. This is a thing that needs to be continuous to how we do business. And if things start drifting on us, then we have to make a decision about what we want to do. And there's a risk decision to be made here that each business has to couple with, which is, do I have the ability to just enforce the rule? If I have the ability to enforce the rule, then I want to use a desired state configuration management tool to enforce the system. And if I do that, then inspect or similar tools like it allow us to just verify that everything's working appropriately and nothing's changing on us. But realistically, in the majority of the large enterprise, we're not yet at a state where we're going to have the power from a security perspective to actually enforce all of the rules across everything. So we need to just start off with reporting everything to get back a results list of are we or are we not compliant? And if we're not compliant, how serious is the problem? And if it's serious, then we can go make decisions about what we're going to do with it.
Very cool. Thank you. Adam, here's one for you, I think. What are the best authoritative kind of sources and for standard configurations? How does CIS view that, and how do you how could you answer that?
Well, I mean, obviously, being from CIS, the best authoritative source is CIS. But there are a few, if I'm understanding the question correctly. There are a couple of other sources of configuration guidance that are out there. Defense Information Systems Agency, I can't remember if they've changed their name or not, DISA, they do provide security technical and implementation guides, although I don't think you can get access to the automation content for that. And then vendors do provide their own guidance as well, although I wouldn't necessarily call that authoritative from the security perspective, especially as it pertains to privacy, because sometimes they will enable certain features that aren't necessarily friendly in that regard, but do bolster them as an IT vendor, if that makes sense. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, I think it did. And how do they map? Do you map your benchmarks to these standards at all, or is it they're distinct and separate?
Right. So in other words, just to ensure I'm understanding the question. So in other words, are CIS benchmarks equated in any way to, for example, a DISA STIG? We do not have those mappings today. You would think that by today it would be an easy thing to accomplish, but unfortunately, the way identifiers are used in this content is not amenable to making that very simple.
Okay, cool. So here's one, I think, for you, Galen. How how do you handle or discuss Windows compliance? One of the main issues that this particular attendee has encountered is the fact that our Chef Automate server only runs on Linux, and in order to get it to talk to Windows via WinRM, you have to disable certain controls. What is the CIS recommendation for that type of approach?
Yeah, so the core structure of what this user is running into is that if we want to run a remote scan against a Windows system, the only way to talk to a Windows box remotely is WinRM. At some point, SSH will be a thing there, and then this can kind of go away. We can make some better recommendations. But one of the core recommendations from CIS is that WinRM should be disabled, right? It's a relatively insecure protocol to work with and is a potential security vulnerability. And so what we can actually do is we can run our agent on the box, right? So there's an inspect agent that actually can run on a Windows system and report back to Automate that way. If we do it that way, and actually if we do that on Linux as well, we can actually get to a spot where we have customers who just disable SSH, WinRM, RDP, et cetera, from all of their production systems. No human ever has an ability to log into a box. And again, the core control plane becomes back in that pipeline, right? The structure of how we make decisions about the infrastructure happens in the conversation in code, and we know very clearly exactly which version of the policy we're following and how it's being followed. And so from a high level, absolutely agree. Talking over WinRM is insecure, and we don't like it. So that's why we recommend an agent-based approach that doesn't require us to use WinRM or SSH for Linux, and that allows us to keep that control disabled and keep us at a higher security level.
Very cool. So Adam, you mentioned some of the trends that you saw in terms of your membership and the numbers of downloads and access to your benchmarks and standards. Could you extrapolate on what other key trends you're seeing in compliance, especially as it relates to this compliance as code? Kind of, forecasting in 3 years when we're talking again about this subject matter, what do you see that structure and environment being like?
Yeah, perfect. Great question, actually. And yeah, great question. So I think one of the bigger trends that I'm seeing, and I'll preface this with mentioning that CIS, myself, and a couple of others are involved in security automation standardization efforts in the IETF and OASIS and a couple of other venues. And what we are trying to accomplish is what we would call semantic interoperability. And I think Galen mentioned this, between different groups, even within an organization, they're speaking different languages. And it's not just even the tools they're using, it's, actually the meanings of the words that they use, right? And before we can really get to the point where the policy we express can actually, be derived to security as code in a sense, or governance as code, we need to get that semantic interoperability kind of accomplished first. So like when we say strong authentication, what are the properties around that matter? What do we really mean when we use that term? And then how does that translate into the tools that we all use? So that, all the different tools that an enterprise uses in their environment can actually work together almost out of the box, which brings me to the second trend. We're starting to see the creation of various ecosystems come to light. One of them that was actually just recently announced, which comes to mind, is this Open Cybersecurity Alliance, which is really just a communication fabric with some, ability for different security automation tools and IT tools for that matter. So, like your asset management system isn't technically considered a security automation tool, but it's definitely critical to your security program, where all of these things can kind of integrate and talk together over a common communication fabric. Anything that makes it easier to get from security policy to implementation in your environment is the general trend that we're starting to see. Did that help?
Yeah, it certainly did. And Galen, what kind of the same question to you, but more with a customer experience, and you're out there talking about compliance as code. What are some of the trends that you see in compliance as code when it relates to customer adoption or kind of the field sales experience there?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we recognize is that benchmarks like CIS are very, very valuable, very in-depth, very detailed. And depending upon your application stack and what you're actually running, there are going to be some things you're going to have to turn off, right? Like there are rules that we're not going to follow. One of the most common examples on Linux is no exec on /temp, right? It's a very common security rule. You don't want people to execute things out of the temp directory. However, there's a number of applications, cost applications, things over the shelf that require that, and we're not going to be able to make that change. And the application is required by the business, and it's just not worth the effort to fight it. And so one of the things that's really critical about security as code and compliance as code is to really understand what is the appropriate risk to take for my organization. And so really that's what we're starting to see now is as people are starting to get this information, this data to them in real time or near real time, seeing their status against the overall benchmark, then they're starting to go make decisions on which of these rules are we going to say we're not going to follow, and what other rules are we going to follow instead to ensure that we retain this high level of security. And so that's really where people are right now. The leaders are really in that conversation, in that space, and codifying all of that together.
Cool. I think there's another product-specific question for you here, Galen. Are the compliance mappings done by CIA's air quotes tagged in inspect, or how are these compliance mappings done essentially?
So I'll start answering some of this and hand over to Adam if he's got some additional points to add on this. But my interpretation of this question is talking about those high-level compliance rules like PCI, SOX, HIPAA, things like that. I typically refer to those things as a soft control, right? There are things like you must have mandatory access control. You must have appropriate security privileges. People shouldn't have access greater than necessary to their jobs. And so Inspec is flexible. Inspec has the ability to tag things inside of it. So you can say this particular control is tagged to these things. You can tag it to a PCI, to a HIPAA, a SOX, things like that. However, the actual, determining what's authoritative on what that tagging looks like, that's a job for the organization, right? Maybe Adam and the CIS folks have built some of those things as authoritative, but again, those are very soft controls, and that they're not a specific technical guideline, but rather the thing should be secure appropriately type rule. Adam, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I can add. I think maybe one thing. So I think you're right. Controls tend to be on a continuum, right? So as you put it, some are soft, and then when you get into certain control frameworks and even some of the sub-controls in the CIS controls, they become a little more specific, right? I think even PCI expresses what your password length should be, which is a very specific thing for what I would call a control framework otherwise. But for those softer relationships, it is definitely an organization, at least at this point, it's definitely an organization's call to make. And I think, again, I'll go back and talk a little bit about that semantic interoperability. The more we can gain common understanding around all the different control terminology that we use, I think that the more we'll be able to approach actually getting to governance as code, where those ties between what you're doing with your computing resource, on the ground, so to speak, can be explicitly derived and deterministically derived, actually, from your policy and your enterprise standards that you bring to bear.
What are the biggest kind of challenges or barriers as we talked about this trend? What are the biggest challenges that you see in the future of this security automation and compliance as code?
Was that to me? Sorry.
Yeah, I think why don't we start with you, Adam?
Yeah, sure. So honestly, the biggest challenge to me is just gaining that shared understanding. So you've got a large marketplace of a variety of different tools, that are out there, and they all accomplish different things. So if you look at, and I'll use this as an example. So the CIS controls, if you go through that document and parse out all the different tools or pieces of software that it either directly talks about or indirectly alludes to, right? I think that number is 37 or 38. Now, your security program, you kind of want to run, automatically. You want it to just work. You want it to work fluidly. And in order for that to work, in its most ideal sense anyway, it seems that a lot of those tools are going to need to be talking to each other, or at least communicating in some form or another, which means that they have to understand the same language. So to me, it starts with that. Like, that's the biggest challenge. Like, how do you get vendors from 37 different spaces essentially to come together and work on that problem?
Yeah, I'll add to that.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll add to that in shared understanding is 100% the kind of the core problem, right? Having that communication layer with each other. And in particular, the way I view it is we need to codify the interactions between development, security, and operations. It's really a lot of what DevOps did was to say, hey, development, here's an API you can hit to grab infrastructure, right? You don't have to go talk to a person anymore. And so the same thing I think is true for security and compliance components, which is to say, I need to have a way for development and operations to consume security automatically, right? We talk about continuous compliance model. We talk about putting it into the development process, putting it into the pipeline. And if we do it right, that we're going to get that shared understanding, we're going to have the conversation in code so that it's not a back and forth of oh, but you agreed to this, but no, I really meant that. No, the code is the source of truth. It's the document. It's the actual source that we're going to use to make a decision on what the security posture is and how we actually manage these systems going forward. So it's all about that shared understanding, and it's really about, for me, it's about putting that shared understanding into a code document that's versioned, that's tracked, et cetera.
Cool. There is, I think, one more question. And again, if you have any other questions, please post them in your Q&A tab. But I think this one is more product specific, Galen, so that this would be for you. What is it? I guess security compliance as code, and what can be achieved by Inspect and cannot be done by Chef Infra or Chef Automate? How Inspect helps with that compared to Chef Automate?
Yeah, so Chef Automate is a dashboarding and reporting mechanism that we have from Chef that really allows us to aggregate our Inspect information along with our Chef Infra information from our systems and make decisions on them. So when we're thinking about compliance as code and viewing this, Automate is the easiest way to do it. Chef Inspect is valuable in and of itself. We can put it into the pipeline. We can run it through our CI tools. We don't need to report it all the way up into Automate in those particular cases. But we're talking about securing or managing our production fleets is really where Inspect is in addition to Chef Infra and Chef Automate. And the Chef Infra is our way to actually enforce it, right? So Chef Infra is a desired state configuration management tool, not the only one in the market, but it's a really powerful tool to allow us to automate the actual tasks of enforcing the rules that we say we want to enforce. And so typically what we see, particularly for existing infrastructure, is that we'll use Inspect and the CIS benchmarks to scan, to run against a set of systems, determine what their current state is, and then start making decisions about which things we want to start changing, and start changing that with Chef Infra. All that's going to get reported into Chef Automate. It allows our engineers and operators a dashboard to look at the progress and understand what the current state of the fleet is.
So there seems to be kind of a follow-up question, I guess, with that is this particular caller automates their infrastructure using Chef Infra or Chef Infra as code or Infra as code in terms of practice. How can that be? So how can we automate compliance, I'm assuming?
Yeah, so I mean, functionally, right, Chef software grew up out of infrastructure as code, out of the DevOps movement. We've been doing that for a decade now. And really, this is just a continuation of that. This is compliance as code. We're saying, hey, look, we recognize that there are times that we are not going to enforce the state, or that we're going to have different owners of things, right? Security and compliance might own what the security rules are, and somebody else has to go enforce them through the operations teams or development or whatever. And so really, this is just a continuation of that process. So automating is really as simple as, again, starting with detection, using inspect and the CIS benchmarks to look at the current state of the systems, and then correcting it using infrastructure as code.
All right, Adam, any kind of closing thoughts? I think we're done with the questions here. Any closing thoughts?
Actually, no, not beyond the things we covered today. Just want to reiterate, thanks for attending today. Thanks for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Galen, any closing thoughts?
No, nothing else. I just want to say thank you for your time. Thanks for attending, and really appreciate everybody paying attention to compliance as code and DevSecOps.
Awesome. I will take over now. Thanks again, Alan, for facilitating questions, and of course, Galen and Adam for the presentation today. So just a few closing items. As a reminder, a copy of the presentation is in the resource list widget, so you can download that now or at a later time. The on-demand version should be available by tomorrow, and we'll send you an email as soon as it's available, so you can access it using the same audience link that you're using right now. And then a reminder and announcement, we are having another webinar in a few weeks, and it will be all about how to get your applications to the cloud. It's called TIS this season for cloud migrations, and it's happening on November 14th. So you can find more information about that webinar and register on the Chef webinars or the Chef events page. So we hope to see you at this next webinar. And with that, thanks again, everybody, for your time, and have an awesome day.